Say mama no mishkiki hector. Put down this tobacco for good medicine only. If I'm feeling grateful or if I'm sad or lonely, when I use it in this way, it helps me to feel better.
So we have with us today the Honorable Allie Greenleaf Maldonado. She is Chief Judge and a citizen of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians. Judge Maldonado is a nationally recognized expert on the Indian Child Welfare Act and the Michigan Indian Family Preservation Act. She has worked extensively with the State Court Administrative Office to bring Michigan into compliance with ICWA, and is a frequent trainer and speaker in the areas of ICWA and MIFPA. Judge Maldonado is also a mother, a colleague, and Anishinaabe Kwe. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce her. Please welcome Judge Maldonado.
Ani, askipagash kikido indijnakas, waganakasing odawa kwe, mashike indodum. I just introduced myself to you in the language, and in the language my name is Greenleaf Talking, because when I speak for my people. I am a member of the Turtle Clan, and I am an Indian woman from the land of the Crooked Tree. And it is a great honor for me to be here with you today, because all of you do some of the most important work that anyone can do. You look out for and protect our children. So it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here with you today. So I have two goals in making this presentation to you. I want to help you understand that Congress passed ICWA to try and make amends for decades of official government policy that resulted in the destruction of the fabric of Native American families. I also want to try and show you that as people who care about children and work in the child welfare system, I believe that we need to reimagine the child welfare system for all kids using ICWA as a model. So I'm going to start by taking you back about 130 years to the boarding school era. How many of you have heard of boarding schools? Raise your hands, please. Oh, wow, that's pretty good. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs, also called the BIA, it was started as a part of the Department of War. I don't know if many of you knew that. Its focus was dealing with the quote-unquote Indian problem. Well, what was the Indian problem? Well, the problem was that despite genocide, relocation to reservations, and allotments, we weren't extinct. That was the problem. Furthermore, tribal governments were operating within the boundaries of the United States. So you had sovereign nations inside of a sovereign nation. That made government officials very uncomfortable. Finally, many Native Americans were living in many respects the same way as their ancestors. So they weren't assimilating into US culture. They were pagan. They were living off the land, they were migratory, and this was against the quote-unquote American way at the time. So to quote-unquote civilize the Indian, policymakers turned to our children. They didn't start there. They started by opening up schools, like a school. They tried an experiment where they took adults and tried to civilize them, change their hair, change their religion. It was a complete failure. They all went back to their communities and re-entered their culture. And so the next thought was, well, they're already set in their ways, they're lost. Let's go for the malleable children. And so that's what they did. Now this particular picture, I don't know if you can see it, it's pretty washed out, but this is a picture of the Carlisle Indian School. It's the very first boarding school in Indian country. And there's a barbed wire fence between that soldier with a gun and the school. That fence is not to keep bad guys out. So Removing Indian children from their families, it was an official government policy. We have tons of documentation to this effect. The testimony of Dr. Robert Berggren from Indian Health Service talked about the policy in testimony before Congress. These are his words, separating Indian children from their parents and tribes has been one of the major aims of government Indian services for generations. The assumption is that children, and particularly those in any kind of difficulty, would be better off being raised by someone other than their own parents. The purpose of the first boarding school on the Navajo reservation, as stated in its charter in the 1890s, was to, quote, remove the Navajo child from the influence of his savage parents. In 1886, the Commissioner on Indian Affairs stated, it is admitted by most people that the adult savage is not susceptible to the influence of civilization, and we must therefore turn to his children, that they might be taught to abandon the pathway of barbarism and walk with a sure step along the pleasant highway of Christian civilization. They must be withdrawn in tender years entirely from the camp and taught to eat, to sleep, to dress, to play, to work, to think after the manner of the white man. So to this end, the Carlisle Indian School became the first boarding school in Indian country. And as you can see from the picture, it was patterned off of a military model. Now, these schools were not voluntary. When parents refused to enroll their children in schools, Indian agents on the reservations normally resorted to withholding rations or sending in agency police. Now, these reservations were in the most desolate, worst areas in the country. And Native people, their weapons, bows and arrows, guns, all prohibited on the reservation. So we were made completely dependent on our treaties and our rights to rations to survive. There was no way for us to go and hunt food or live the old ways. So they essentially threatened to starve our entire families unless we sent them some of our children. These handcuffs are actual handcuffs. They're currently in the Haskell, the museum at the Haskell Indian School. Little tiny handcuffs. This is what they use to drag these kids off the reservations. In some cases, police were sent onto reservations to seize children whether they were willing or not, and the police continued to take children until the schools were filled. So sometimes orphans were offered, and in other cases, families would bargain, negotiate like a family quota. And I know families like this on my reservation. They had 5 kids, and they said, please don't take all my children here, just take these 2. And this has destroyed families on my reservation. We have siblings that absolutely, the ones that got sent away, brokenhearted that they were chosen to be sent to these boarding schools, and just the chasm that it caused in the family. The parents might have thought, well, you know, she's tougher, he's older, leave the little ones. But these families now within our own communities are at war because this was forced upon us. So Pratt's motto was, kill the Indian in him and save the man. Carlisle, as well as other non-reservation boarding schools, instituted their assault on cultural identity by first doing away with all outward signs of tribal life that the children brought with them. So if the boys had long hair, they cut their hair, as you can see in this picture. This picture is a Navajo boy. The picture on the right was when he entered the boarding school, and the picture on the left is the same boy 3 years later. Students were not allowed to speak their native language or practice their religion. All children were given standard uniforms to wear. Whatever clothes they came in with were burned. They received new white names, and regimentation was the order of the day, and students spent endless hours marching to and from classes, meals, and dormitories. My great-uncle Leo, who I had the great pleasure of spending a year with when I moved back home. He was in one of these boarding schools as well, and he talked about marching from place to place to place. It was very much like this. Order, discipline, and self-restraint were prized values of white society. Now, these boarding schools, they taught reading, writing, and math, but they were not the kind of boarding schools to which wealthy Europeans sent their kids. Half of each school day was for industrial training. So what they did was they said, okay, well, what kind of jobs are Indians going to have when they graduate from these schools? And that's what Indian people spent half the day doing. So for girls, they learned to cook, clean, and sew. And for boys, they learned skills such as blacksmithing, shoemaking, or manual labor on the farm. Not a big variety there, but that was predicted to be their place in society. Kids in the summertime were outsourced and not allowed to go home. What do I mean by that? My uncle Leo was at the Mount Pleasant Indian School for 9 years without going home. And in the summertime, they sent him to a local farm where he worked for free under the auspice of like an internship. So he's learning job skills, right? It's a good gig. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, and child molestation in these facilities was rampant. And 50% of the kids that attended these boarding schools died before they reached the age of 18. Can you imagine sending your child to a school with that kind of mortality rate? So Carlisle and its curriculum, with this on its plate, became a model for schools across the nation, sponsored by the government, by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. By 1902, there were 25 federally funded boarding schools across 15 states and territory, with a total enrollment of over 6,000 kids. At this time, our population was down to a little bit over 400,000. And these are the federal schools. They also, after this Carlisle school, a bunch of religious schools, mainly run by the Catholic Church, also were promulgated across the country. So 1 in 4 of our kids were in these schools. What's the result of this? Well, generations of Indian people, they learned how to parent from the dorms of these BIA schools. Think about how many people here are parents? Think about where you learned how to parent. Who taught you what you know about parenting? Well, it's probably your mother or your father or your grandparents, whoever raised you. Well, boarding schools, the federal government, they don't make good parents. So most boarding schools in the United States were closed in the 1970s. Boarding schools broke the fabric of Native American families. And I know this firsthand because it broke the fabric of my family. My grandmother and my uncles, all of them, my great uncles, they all attended the boarding schools. As a result, every single one of them suffered from alcoholism. My grandmother died of an overdose at a young age. My great uncle Oakley didn't make it to 21. Uncle Dale, he didn't make it to 54, died very young, substance abuse problem. Only my Uncle Leo, who was able to transition into the Navy after the Carlisle Indian School, he was able to stop drinking and live a relatively normal and productive life. And I don't know, I bet you Stacy could tell you this too, and probably Bob, I don't know one person who doesn't have a family member today that wasn't affected by the boarding schools. It's not something that happened a long time ago. It's my grandmother. And it's relevant to who we are. let's go forward 50 years. And I'm going to talk to you about the Indian Adoption Project. Now, there were multiple projects like this going on across the country, but a really good friend of mine named Susan Harness was actually part of this project. She was one of the children, and so I happen to know just a little bit more about this particular one because she wrote an absolutely fabulous book about it. She's an anthropologist, and if you want to, she studied the American Indian Adoption Project, so if you have any interest in this, look for her book. So the Indian Adoption Project, it ran from 1958 to 1967, and it was a collaboration between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Child Welfare League of America. Now, I want to preface this by saying everyone involved really had the best intentions. Honestly, even with the boarding schools, if you look at the, their intentions on their face, what were they trying to do? Civilize Indians, make them Christian, assimilate them into society. The desire wasn't, it was just wrong. It wasn't mean, it was wrong. Well, this is another such experiment. It was an experiment of transracial adoption, and it extended across the United States. The purpose was to give Indian children all the advantages of white society by removing them from the reservations. Reservations at this time were still very isolated, and they contained some of the worst pockets of poverty in the country. They were marked by high infant mortality, low health care, and worse housing than city slums. The reservations also had high unemployment and low literacy. Nearly 60% of Indian people had less than an 8th grade education. So within the realm of social services, people got together and tried to figure out, what are we going to do about this problem? Well, it was thought that American Indian children would fare better if they were removed from the reservation and placed into white homes. Now, I would have said, well, let's make the reservations better, but I wasn't there. So, what were the results of the American Indian Adoption Project? Well, I'm going to tell you the opinion of one person, but from my friend's book, I think he adequately represents the results of the project. I'm an angry Indian, says Roger St. John. I'm more than glad to tell you I'm pissed off. He's a 49-year-old truck driver with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. I was the youngest of 16 children, grabbed at the age of 4, along with 3 other brothers. No paperwork, nothing. The other kids in the family escaped because they took off. Soon St. John and his siblings ended up in New York City at Thanksgiving time. The year was 1966. He writes, "We were on the front page of the newspaper along with lots of good people talking about the holiday and adoption. We were brought up without our culture, which took a terrible toll on our lives. I grew up angry and miserable." Best intentions. So, Carol Locust, which my friend had identified for me as a writer who she talks about in her book, she describes what Native American adoptees suffer from that are placed outside of their communities as split feather syndrome, the damage caused by loss of tribal identity and growing up different in an inhospitable world. She writes, "Even in loving families, Native adoptees live without a sense of who they are. Love doesn't provide identity." So now let's just go back 37 years ago. Well, tribes had enough. And in 1974, they went to Congress. Congress began a series of hearings regarding Indian child welfare in the U.S. Numerous experts and witnesses from across the country gave sworn testimony under oath. The disturbing facts revealed at those hearings showed that federal and state governments had a well-known policy of removing children from their families and tribes in an attempt to assimilate them into white culture by placing them in white families and on institutions. And if you want to read, if you have nothing to do and you want to read this testimony one day, it's about 500 pages, but it's available online. I've actually read it, and it's pretty heartbreaking. Since the late 1800s, an overwhelming percentage of Indian children were removed from their homes and communities and placed in boarding schools or foster care off their tribal reservations in order to teach them white culture and practices and indoctrinate them into Christianity. In many cases, government authorities removed Indian children from their families because of unsubstantiated claims of neglect and because non-Indian social workers didn't understand the cultural differences in the child-rearing practices of Native Americans. The practice of systematically removing and disconnecting Indian children from their tribes went on for more than 100 years, and it placed the very existence of tribes at risk. Think about it. When they took our children, they took our future leaders. During the 1974 hearings, it became clear to Congress that the United States had a crisis of mass proportion on their hands. The national statistics shocked congressional leaders. In Montana, the rate of Indian foster care placement was at least 13 times greater than for non-Indian children. In South Dakota, 40% of all adoptions made by the state were Indian children, and yet Indians only made up 7% of the population, the juvenile population. The number of South Dakota Indian children that lived in foster homes in the 1970s was per capita nearly 16 times greater than that of the non-Indian rate. The state of Washington, the Indian adoption rate was 19 times greater, and the foster care rate was 10 times greater. And in Michigan, if you were Native American, you were 360% more likely to be in foster care if you were Native American. This is a real picture, and I think that this picture very accurately shows and portrays the boarding schools. Official government policy was destroying the fabric of Indian families and endangering the very existence of tribal governments. The numbers were shocking, that's true, but it was people's personal stories that brought those statistics to life for Congress. Examples of sworn testimony given under oath were heard by Congress regarding Indian child welfare practices. For example, Mr. William Byler, Executive Director of the Association on American Indian Affairs, he testified about an Indian family in where children were living with their grandparents. The grandmother was off doing shopping, and the grandfather was 3 miles away getting water from a well. While the grandparents were out, the social worker stopped by and found the children fighting. When the grandfather returned, the children were just gone. The grandparents were never successful in finding their grandchildren. They were just placed for adoption somewhere. The children were taken from the home of the grandparents, the only home that they'd ever known, and were never allowed to see them again, and the grandparents were not allowed to fight to try and get them back. In fact, it often happened that Indian children were removed from their Indian parents or Indian custodians without any notice that there were any kind of legal proceedings against them. Poverty, poor housing, lack of modern plumbing, and overcrowding were often cited in the documents that we have by social workers as proof of parental neglect and were used as grounds for beginning child custody proceedings. Physical abuse was cited in just 1% of the cases for removal. All others were based on somebody's subjectively judging Indian behavior or the environment in the home. Reports show that another reason many Indian children were removed from their homes was because unrelated people living in the homes with them were cohabitating but not married. Now, at this time, you had states where living in sin was actually illegal. But on the reservations, sometimes more than 50% of the people lived in a common law situation. These unions, sometimes they lasted 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and the people didn't have enough money to afford divorces, and they wanted a family life, so they lived together without marriage. On these reservations, the police would come in and make a sweep of the whole reservation and arrest people that were living in illicit cohabitation. And people living in illicit cohabitation, they were subject to having their kids taken away from them. In a California case, the state removed the child of a Rosebud Sioux member simply for poverty. At the mother's bidding, the child's aunt took the 3-year-old from the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota to California. The mother was to follow. By the time she arrived, just 1 week later, the child had been placed in a pre-adoptive home by California social workers. The social workers asserted that although they had no evidence that the mother was unfit, it was their belief that an Indian reservation is an unsuitable environment for a child, and that pre-adoptive parents were financially able to provide a home and way of life superior to the one furnished by the mother. Now, in this case, an attorney was successful in getting the child returned to the mother, but I really find this case ironic because tribes were forced under reservation at gunpoint, prohibited from leaving without a permit, and then later we're told that we live in a place unfit for raising our children. So the decision to take Indian children from their natural homes, in most cases, it was carried out without any due process of law. For example, it was rare for either Indian child or their parents to be represented by an attorney or to have the supporting testimony of an expert witness. Many cases, they didn't go through any kind of adjudicatory process at all because there was a wave of these voluntary waivers of parental rights employed by social workers to gain custody of children. Now, you got to think of the circumstances. Most of these people were illiterate, so they were completely dependent on the social workers to explain what the documents meant to them. And every time they had, and again, also for food and substances, they had to sign. So if they wanted to get their welfare checks, they had to sign paperwork, and they didn't know what they were signing. They just knew they signed it, they got their money. Person after person after person testified that they thought they were signing so they could get their checks, and later they were told, you just signed away your parental rights. So further testimony proved that custody proceedings against Indian people were also sometimes begun not to rescue the children for dangerous circumstances, but just to punish parents that were engaged in conduct that the social workers disapproved of. An example of that is if, a woman who is a single mother had a boyfriend that she was obviously engaged in a relationship with. And we have documentation of that. So, particularly disturbing to Congress was the fact that the massive removal of Indian children from their families, it was not being done by some rogue individuals, but instead it came from official government policy. Okay, so what was the result of this official government policy of removing Indian children from their families and placing them into non-Indian adoptive homes and boarding schools? Well, the testimony of William Byler, Executive Director of the Association on American Indian Affairs, this is what he testified to Congress. Statistical and anecdotal information show that Indian children who grow up in a non-Indian setting become spiritual and cultural orphans. They do not entirely fit into the culture in which they are raised, and they yearn throughout their life for the family and the tribal culture denied to them as children. Many Native children raised in non-Indian homes experience identity problems, drug addiction, alcoholism, incarceration, and most disturbingly, suicide. In fact, we have some of the highest suicide rates in the country. Dr. Joseph Westmeyer further testified about the results. In his extensive experience working with Native Americans who'd been in foster care, virtually all the people he worked with reported they'd been placed in multiple foster homes, some of them bouncing from home to home without warning. Furthermore, none of the individuals he treated ever returned permanently to their Indian communities because they no longer fit in there. Yet they never felt like they fit in with the dominant society either. And my friend Susan Harness, it's funny because the first time, she's an amazing speaker. If you ever get a chance to hear her speak, she's incredible. And she talked about this from her perspective. She called it living on the fringe. And I never really realized that's how I felt as well. Until I heard her speak, I didn't have words that articulated it. But my story, which is not that different from people in my community, my mother, when her mother died at a very young age, she was not placed with someone in the community. We literally had dozens of relatives, a plumber, my uncle Leo, who'd been in the Navy, could have placed him there. But that's not what they did with Indian kids. They sent her to another state to live with a Mennonite minister and his wife. And she describes herself as being a house slave there. She was forced to cut her hair, and my mother's really, really dark. She says that they put Clorox on her skin to try to lighten her up. She was beaten if she spoke her language or tried to practice the teachings, the religion that had been passed on to her. And she was taught to hate the fact that she was Native American, essentially to hate herself. She was told to lie and say that she was Armenian instead of Native American. Imagine in this day and age, you were better off being Arab than being Native American. Wow. And to this day, she will not come back to the reservation. She says she's an apple, red on the outside, white on the inside. So I understand this feeling of living on the fringe. My mother married the whitest white man she could find, my dad. And I mean literally, my dad's skin is so white you can see the blue veins running through it. Wonderful man. And she tried as hard as she could to live the white American dream. But she never fit in, and she still suffers from alcoholism and drug addiction. And I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, never seeing a face that looked like mine, having everyone ask me, am I Japanese? Am I Chinese? And what was that code for to me as a child? Well, you're not one of us, so what are you? And my dad, he built oil refineries, so we moved all the time, and wherever we moved, I got the same thing. I was the prevalent, in California, am I Mexican? Wherever we went. And so even in class, and Susan and I had this exact same experience. First day of school was always horrible for me because I'd sit there and, my dad's name is Schlechter. So teachers calling roll, Mary, John, Ben, get to me. Teacher'd always stop, look at me, look at my name. Immediately I'm being singled out in front of all my peers. Now, the teacher's not trying to do this to me, but they're trying to figure me out. Here I am, I got this German last name. My dad's a Jew, so it's Schlechter, right? But I don't look too German. So they look at me and they'd be like, they want me to explain myself. And so this would happen to me on the first day of school in every class, every year. I was living on the fringe. I didn't have a Native community to go home to and share this experience, a place where other people could understand my pain. I was just alone. So this is today. So the government policy of removal, it threatened the very existence of tribes themselves. Tribes gave testimony before Congress, and they said, culturally, the chances of Indian survival are significantly reduced if our children, the only real means for the transmission of our tribal heritage, are to be raised in non-Indian homes and denied exposure to the ways of their people. The well-known official government policy of removing our children was destroying the very fabric of Native American families and damaging Native American youth, which ultimately that threatened the very existence of Indian tribes. Because Native children, they're a tribe's future citizens, voters, and leaders. And without our children, we have no future. So in a shocking move, Congress actually took responsibility for the state of Indian families and what they had done to them, and passed the Indian Child Welfare Act to help fix what official government policy had broken. ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, was written with the understanding that tribes are in the best position to decide what is in the best interest of Indian children, because we love our children too. ICWA attempts to fix what official government policy broke by promoting the following goals. Protect the best interest of Indian children and families as determined by their tribes. That's the number one goal of ICWA. Promote the stability and security of Indian families, and recognize and strengthen the role of tribal governments in determining child custody issues. Now, although my family suffered because of pre-ICWA practices, my family is also an example of what can happen when ICWA is followed. This is my family. That beautiful little red-haired, blue-eyed boy is my son. And he's a citizen of a little river band of Odawa Indians. And he is my son because of ICWA. Don't let red hair and blue eyes fool you. My son's actually more Native American in blood than I am. It's just how genetics sometimes works. So Riley's 14-year-old biological mother, she ran away to Nevada, where she gave birth. The state of Nevada immediately took custody of the baby and placed him into a non-relative, non-Indian placement. However, the Little River Band was properly notified under ICWA, and the tribe was allowed to intervene as required by ICWA. Now, the good people of Nevada, they wanted to follow ICWA, so they asked the Little River Band for an appropriate placement for Riley. If Nevada had not followed ICWA, under Nevada law, the family that brought him home from the hospital would have maintained custody and would have had the first right to adopt him if no family members came forward. No family members that were suitable ever did come forward. And I knew the family that took him home. They're really wonderful people, and they would have adopted him. They were nice people, absolutely lovely people, but they had no ties to the Native community whatsoever. My son would have been brought up thousands of miles away from his tribe and his culture, but for the Indian Child Welfare Act. However, because he's Indian and Nevada followed federal law, he was transported back to Michigan and placed into foster care with my husband and me. I'm from a sister tribe and a member of the same clan as my son. We're both Turtle Clan. So the tribe decided that we were an appropriate placement. After about 2 years of trying to reunite him with his birth mother, both parents voluntarily gave up their parental rights, and we were allowed to adopt him. Because of that, my son is growing up with his culture. He's 8 now, and his culture and community are very important to him. He goes to powwows. We regularly attend tribal community events. He's learning about traditional medicines, and I'm very proud to say that my son is a snow snake champion. And if you want to know what that is, you can ask me after. It is also of the utmost importance that my son is being raised to be a good citizen of the Little River Band and the United States. When my son turns 18 and has to vote in the future about the wolf hunt in Michigan, he's going to understand why his people oppose that hunt. He will know that Mayinga is our cousin. When he has to vote on fishing and treaty rights, he will be well informed because his elders have told him why the fish are so important to us and why they must be protected. He has the possibility now, because he was brought home under ICWA, of becoming a leader in his community. He's potentially the next generation of leadership for his tribe. None of that would have been possible if good people didn't follow the Indian Child Welfare Act. So ICWA attempts to accomplish its purpose by primarily establishing a minimum federal standard for the removal of Indian children from their homes and for the placement of Indian children in homes that reflect the values of Indian culture. In other words, compared to pre-ICWA practices, ICWA purposely makes it more difficult for state governments to remove Indian children from their homes, and it requires that they be placed in Indian homes and Indian communities whenever possible. Why would we want to make it harder for states to put Native American children in foster care today? Well, what'd you learn in kindergarten? You fix it, you break it. And in a remarkable, stunning move, the federal government took responsibility for what they did. Thus, we have ICWA. But because we want for Native families what we want for Native families what we want for all families. But we owe it to Native American families. But I want to invite you to think bigger than that. I think ICWA, when they drafted ICWA, this is how it was done. It's the only federal law regarding child welfare, and that's because child welfare is typically just a state law issue. That's a state issue. So when they were drafting ICWA, they brought child welfare experts from across the country together, and they said, what would the best practices be for child welfare? And that's how ICWA was developed. And I believe, and I invite you to believe with me, that ICWA is the gold standard we should be using for all of our children. All of our children deserve it. So why is ICWA the gold standard? Well, there's over now the next section, I'm going to give you a lot of statistics, and I don't think I emailed those into your packets. If you want them, take my email address. They're mostly from the Casey Foundation and the federal government. I have all these statistics for you. Over 400,000 youth were in foster care in the United States as of September of 2013. This number includes over 250,000 new entries into foster care. This is double the number of the 1980s. We're going the wrong direction. Now, this is what we want to think that foster care looks like. But in most instances, foster care is not the Leave It to Beaver family. Over 50% of foster care alumni will have 7 or more placements. That's not acceptable. 32% will have 8 or more placements. About 3% will have 20 plus placements. The average child spends 2 years in foster care. 20% spend over 5 years. Why do we put kids in foster care? We want better outcomes for them. Are we getting that? More than 1/3 will experience 3 or more school changes. More than 75% will not remain in school once placed in foster care. Almost 65% will be transferred in the middle of the school year. Now, I've got a friend, the judge, that told me this story that I want to share with you about a young lady in Michigan who was in foster care. She had been removed so many times that, and for her, she had one major goal in mind. She wanted to graduate high school on time. And so in order to do this, she carried her own school records with her everywhere she went in a backpack. She knew she had been removed so many times and placed into new homes, and every time that happened, she'd be placed in homeroom for a couple weeks, and she risked being left behind. So to avoid that situation, she took it upon herself to remedy it. Now, she's an extraordinary young lady, but that's not something a child should have to even think about. Only 58% of the kids in foster care will graduate high school by the age of 19. Is that the better outcome we're looking for? A disproportionate number will receive a GED instead of diploma. And those who reach the 10th or 11th grade, on average, they'll only read at a 7th grade reading level. By the way, my son is reading at a high school level, and he's 8. 36% will repeat a grade, and fewer than 3% will earn a college degree by the age of 25, compared to 28% of all 25-year-olds. Better outcome? One-third of kids in foster care will experience abuse or maltreatment during foster care, including sexual and physical abuse and neglect. And in Michigan, we're seeing record numbers of failed adoptions, and second and third generation foster care is happening more and more often. I'm sure some of you are dealing with that now. More than half will have clinical levels of at least one mental health problem. 1 in 5 will have 3 or more mental health problems. 1 in 4 will experience PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And PTSD rates for alumni were up to twice as high as for U.S. war veterans. Think about that. It is more traumatic to be in foster care than to go to war for your country. $23,000 kids will age out of foster care this year. Aging out of the system, well, I'm sure you guys know this to some extent, but it carries its own set of risks. Who among us here only made good decisions? Raise your hand if you only made good decisions at 18 and 19 years old. Me neither. But we had the ability to correct and learn from our mistakes. Okay. We survived because we had cheerleaders in our camp. And when life knocked us down, we had people to pick us back up. A lot of these kids just don't. So are they better off? 1 in 4 will be involved in the justice system within 2 years of leaving foster care. 42% of young men, 20% of women will be arrested. 23% of young men, and 8% of young women will be convicted of a crime within 2 years of leaving foster care. 45% of young men and 18% of young women will be incarcerated. And one study showed that 80% of the population in jail had spent some time in foster care. So if you want to talk about a pipeline, foster care, jail, pipeline. More than 1 in 5 foster care alumni become homeless by the age of 18. By the age of 24, only half will be employed. 1/3 will have household incomes at or below the poverty level. That's 3 times the national rate. 35% will meet the criteria for a substance abuse disorder, and 71% of young women within 2 years of leaving foster care will become pregnant. And the cycle will begin again. So as a judge, when I have social workers come in and they've got 4 kids, I'm acutely aware of these statistics. And I have to look at those kids and ask myself, which one's going to be homeless? Which one's going to be incarcerated? Which one's going to be dead? So as social workers, when you come in and you bring a case like that to me, you better not say, well, Judge, we can't exactly substantiate abuse right now, but we should remove these children just to be safe. Because that goes on the false assumption that there's no consequences to placing kids in foster care. And that's absolutely not true. That we have the statistics that show it. I had a social worker do that once. She came in and said, well, we better be safe than sorry. I'll tell you this, she didn't do it twice. We know that stranger foster care is harmful. Foster care is not a neutral. In deciding if foster care is needed, we have to balance the risk with the harms. That's our job. If foster care is needed, we've got to do everything we can to minimize that harm. So here's how I'd do it if I were king of the world and I could change the system for everyone. I would apply the Indian Child Welfare Act in every situation. And the reason I do that is because that's what I'd want you to do if somebody that I loved became wrapped up in the foster care system. A friend, a cousin, if they got into some sort of difficulty and their children became wrapped up in foster care system, this is what I'd want for them. And I think that's what you'd want for someone you loved as well. First, you'd want the system to do everything possible to help the family before seeking removal. That's the active efforts portion of the Indian Child Welfare Act. You want them to ask people in the child's community if they could do something to help the family to stay together. That's the notice requirement to the tribe. You'd want the system to hire an expert to make absolutely certain that removal is absolutely the only way to keep that child safe. That's the qualified expert witness requirement of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And you would not want them to remove the child from the home unless the child would be at serious risk of physical or emotional damage unless removed. That's the clear and convincing evidence standard of the Indian Child Welfare Act. If you must remove a child, and that happens, we all see it, you'd want that child placed with a loving family member or a member of that child's community. That's the placement preferences. Now, it's pretty easy to identify an Indian child's community, right? Because you can look to the tribe. But every kid has a community. Does that child go to church? Then that church might be that child's community. Does that kid play baseball? Maybe the coach or someone on the team is part of that child's community. Kid's best friend, that family might be his family might be part of the community. Somebody at school, a teacher. It's more work, but our kids deserve it. So if placing the child with a family or community is not possible, ask the family and community what they think is best for that child, because who knows that child best? Their family and community, right? Well, that's the tribe's right to change the placement preferences under ICWA. And if you must remove a child, place the child, if it's not possible, understand what's at stake for that child. And only move to termination of parental rights when everything else fails. And that's ICWA's beyond a reasonable doubt standard, including the testimony of at least one qualified expert witness, that continued custody with the parent is likely to result in serious physical or emotional damage to the child. So, you wouldn't be here today, you wouldn't do what you do, if you didn't love children as much as I do. Chi miigwech to all of you, and thank you for being here.
Say mama no mishkiki hector. Put down this tobacco for good medicine only. If I'm feeling grateful or if I'm sad or lonely, when I use it in this way, it helps me to feel better. Need my moon, my back, say mama no mishkiki hector.